George Joseph Smith married at least 7 women under 6 different names, defrauded 5 of them out of everything they owned, and drowned 3 of them in their own bathtubs to collect insurance money. His 1915 trial at the Old Bailey became one of the most sensational criminal cases England had ever seen, and the legal precedent it set is still taught in law schools today. Smith came into the world on the 11th of January, 1872, in Bethnal Green, London, the son of an insurance agent. By 9 years old, the boy had already landed in a reformatory at Gravesend in Kent, where he stayed locked up until the age of 16. What followed was a revolving door of prison cells between the ages of 16 and 27, all on theft and fraud charges. A 6-month stretch at Lambeth Police Court came in 1891 for stealing a bicycle, and another 12 months followed in 1896 after he talked a woman into robbing her own employers. Criminal proceeds funded a baker's shop in Leicester for a time, but by 1902, the Metropolitan Police had catalogued him in their habitual criminals register under the alias Oliver George Love. 5 feet 7.5 inches tall, 161 pounds, with prominent cheekbones hidden behind an oversized moustache, Smith cut an unsettling figure. Alice Burnham's father would later describe him as a man of very evil appearance. And someone else who crossed his path put it more bluntly, saying Smith bore eyes like that of a mad dog. Most men found him brusque and deeply unpleasant, but with certain women he possessed what contemporaries called a masterful, hypnotic way. These women tended to be genteel, lonely, around the age of 30, working as domestic servants or companions to the elderly. Even Smith's own defense counsel would eventually suggest some genuine hypnotic influence over his victims. Every scheme Smith ran followed a system. Personal advertisements served as his hunting ground, sometimes offering positions for housekeepers, other times presenting himself as a travelling antiques dealer, drifting through seaside and provincial towns. Single women with modest family savings and few social connections drew his attention. Women one account described as almost on the shelf, desperate to escape lives spent in service to others. Courtship moved fast, sometimes wrapping up in just a few weeks, and once the marriage certificate was signed under whatever false name Smith had chosen, he drained the new wife's savings, sold her possessions, and vanished. One victim, named Sarah Faulkner, experienced this in an almost cartoonishly brazen way, because Smith took her to the National Gallery in London, excused himself to use the bathroom, doubled back to their hotel, and walked off with her remaining £350, along with her jewellery and every stitch of her clothing. What earned Smith his infamous nickname, though, was the method he reserved for certain wives. That pattern ran deeper and darker. A new bride would sign a will naming Smith as sole beneficiary, and then an insurance policy would appear. A visit to a local doctor always followed, during which Smith claimed his wife suffered from epileptic fits. After that came the search for lodgings, and Smith always rejected rooms that lacked one specific feature, a bathtub. Drowning a person, without leaving marks of violence, turns out to be disturbingly simple, if you know how. Smith would seize his victim by the ankles and pull sharply upward while she bathed, sending a sudden rush of water into the nose and throat that caused instant shock and unconsciousness. Before each killing, he stepped out to buy provisions like fish, eggs, or tomatoes, establishing an alibi so he could return and discover the body. Each victim ended up in a pauper's grave. Smith's first marriage, and the only one that held any legal standing, took place in January of 1898 inches Leicester. Caroline Beatrice Thornhill, just 18 years old, married a man calling himself George Oliver Love. That name was a lie, and the marriage quickly turned into something worse than a sham. Smith forced Caroline to work as a maid and steal from her employers, a scheme that fell apart when she was caught pawning silver spoons in Worthing and sentenced to 12 months. Once released, Caroline turned on Smith and gave evidence against him, landing him in prison in January 1901 for 2 years on receiving stolen goods. After his release, Caroline fled all the way to Canada. They never divorced, which meant everything that came after was bigamy. Florence Wilson, a widow from Worthing, became wife number 2 in June of 1908. and Smith cleaned her out of £30 before selling the contents of their Camden Town home and disappearing within weeks. Just 1 month after that, on the 30th of July, 1908, a woman named Edith Pegler responded to Smith's advertisement for a housekeeper. And this marriage turned out to be unlike all the others. Edith was the only bigamous wife Smith married under his real name, and he never stole a penny from her. She became his anchor, the woman he returned to between other marriages for 7 straight years. Months would pass with Smith claiming to be off selling antiques, and he always came back carrying money stolen from other women. Edith seems to have had no idea. Sarah Freeman followed in October of 1909, losing £400 before Smith abandoned her. And that is when things turned lethal. On the 26th of August 1910, in the seaside town of Weymouth, a 33-year-old woman named Beatrice Mundy married a man calling himself Henry Williams. Bessie, as everyone called her, was the daughter of a deceased bank manager, and she held an inheritance worth £2,500 locked inside a family trust. Smith couldn't crack the trust at first, managing to extract only £138 in cash. So he deserted her and left behind a deliberately cruel letter accusing her of giving him a venereal disease. 2 years passed before fate intervened in the strangest possible way. Smith and Bessie bumped into each other on the seafront at Weston-super-Mare, purely by chance, and Smith immediately recognized the opportunity sitting right in front of him. Convincing Bessie to take him back, he moved them to Herne Bay in Kent, renting a house at 80 High Street. That house lacked a bathtub, so Smith went out and bought a cast-iron tub, haggling the price down from £2 to £1, 17 shillings and sixpence. A local doctor named Frank French received a visit from the couple, during which Smith insisted Bessie suffered from epileptic seizures, though Bessie herself could only recall having headaches. On the 8th of July 1912, both of them signed mutual wills. 5 days later, on the 13th of July, Smith walked into a fishmonger's shop and then returned home to report that his wife was dead in the bathtub. Dr. French arrived to find Bessie's body, head down in the tub, legs stretched straight, feet protruding over the edge, a bar of soap still clutched in her hand. No marks of violence anywhere on her body. The inquest returned a verdict of death by misadventure. £2,579, 13 shillings and 7 pence. That is what Smith collected, roughly equivalent to over £300,000 in today's money. And what did he do next? Smith went back to the ironmonger and returned the bathtub for a refund. Alice Burnham, a 25-year-old nurse, married Smith on the 4th of November 1913 inches, Portsmouth, and this time he used his real name. Alice's father, Charles, a fruit grower from Aston Clinton in Buckinghamshire, despised Smith from the very first meeting, calling him a man of very evil appearance and admitting he could not sleep while Smith was in the house. None of that stopped Smith from draining Alice's savings of £132 and insuring her life for £500. A will appeared naming Smith as beneficiary, and he dictated a letter for Alice to send to her parents, calling him the best husband in the world. On the 12th of December 1913, the couple checked into the Blackpool boarding house run by Joseph and Margaret Crossley, but only after Smith had rejected another lodging house because it lacked a bathtub. That evening, Alice went upstairs for a bath, and the landlady noticed a water stain spreading across the ceiling below the bathroom. Smith had stepped out to buy eggs. Alice was found dead. The inquest recorded accidental drowning through heart failure, and Smith walked away with approximately £632. September of 1914 brought another marriage in Woolwich, this time to a woman named Alice Reed, also known as Alice Reevil, and Smith used the alias Charles Oliver James. £90 disappeared from her accounts, along with all her clothing, which Smith later handed to Edith Pegler back home. Alice Reed survived. The final marriage proved to be Smith's undoing. On the 17th of December, 1914, in the city of Bath, an irony that newspapers noted at the time, Smith married Margaret Elizabeth Lofty under the name John Lloyd, presenting himself as a land agent. Margaret was 38, a clergyman's daughter, a spinster who had spent her working life as a companion to elderly ladies, and she carried only £19 in cash. Smith insured her life for £700. Lodgings at 14 Bismarck Road in Highgate, London, became the couple's new address, but only after Smith had tried a different boarding house first and complained that the bathtub was too small. At Bismarck Road, his very first question to the landlady concerned whether the room had a bath. 3 hours separated Margaret's final 2 acts on earth. On the 18th of December, 1914, she withdrew all her savings and signed a will, making John Lloyd her sole beneficiary, and by that evening she was dead. A hot bath had been drawn at 7:30. The landlady heard a commotion upstairs, followed by the sound of someone playing "Nearer My God to Thee" on the parlour organ. At 8:15, the front door slammed, the doorbell rang, and there stood Smith, holding tomatoes, claiming he'd forgotten his key. Margaret's body lay in the bathtub. At the funeral, Smith told the underkeeper he wanted the service finished quickly. A newspaper brought George Joseph Smith down. Before Christmas of 1914, the News of the World published a report about the death of Margaret Elizabeth Lloyd in her bathtub in Highgate, and 2 people reading that article, completely independent of one another, recognized the same disturbing pattern. Joseph Crossley ran the Blackpool boarding house where Alice Burnham had died exactly 1 year earlier, and the moment he spotted the article, alarm bells went off. On the 3rd of January, 1915, Crossley wrote to Scotland Yard on behalf of his wife and Alice's father, Charles Burnham, enclosing 2 newspaper clippings that placed identical deaths side by side. Charles Burnham had already sent his own material to police in Aylesbury, who forwarded everything to the Yard. Divisional Detective Inspector Arthur Neal of Scotland Yard caught the case, and his first move was a visit to 14 Bismarck Road to examine the bathtub in person. Too small for an adult to drown accidentally. That was Neal's immediate assessment. Interviews with the coroner, Dr. Stephen Bates, revealed a will signed 3 hours before death, every penny of savings withdrawn that same day, and a £700 life insurance policy taken out just 3 days prior. Neal's trap was elegant in its simplicity. Dr. Bates issued a favourable report to the Yorkshire Insurance Company at Neal's request, and then round-the-clock surveillance began at the solicitor's office. On the 1st of February, 1915, a man matching Smith's description walked through the door. Neal confronted him directly, asking if he was John Lloyd. Confirmation came immediately. Neal's follow-up question, asking whether the man was also George Smith, drew a vehement denial. Once told he was being detained on suspicion of bigamy, the man stopped protesting and admitted he was George Joseph Smith. News coverage of the brides in the bath rippled outward fast, and the chief police officer of Herne Bay responded by sending Neal a report about Bessie Mundy's suspiciously similar death back in 1912, filed under the name Mrs. Henry Williams. Neal's investigation eventually carried his team through more than 40 towns across England and produced interviews with 150 witnesses. Formal arrest came on the 15th of February, 1915, followed by charges at Bow Street Police Court on the 23rd of March for 3 counts of murder. 9 working days. That is how long the trial of George Joseph Smith consumed at the Old Bailey. Beginning on the 22nd of June, 1915, Mr. Justice Scrutton presided. Archibald Bodkin, a man who would later rise to become Director of Public Prosecutions, led the prosecution alongside Travers Humphreys, while the defence fell to Sir Edward Marshall Hall, widely regarded as one of the finest barristers of his generation.